The summer of 1942 saw the most aggressive and arguably the most reckless gamble of Adolf Hitler's military career, a relentless drive to seize a single city on the banks of the Volga River, a city named Stalingrad. This obsession was rooted not just in strategy, but in symbolism, a deep, visceral need to defeat the namesake of his communist rival, Joseph Stalin. The failure to capture this single industrial hub would doom the entire Axis campaign in the east and bleed the German army dry. Compelling evidence. After the failure to capture Moscow in 1941, Hitler shifted his focus south in Operation Blue, aiming to secure the vital Caucasian oil fields necessary to fuel the war machine. Stalingrad was a crucial secondary objective. It was a major industrial center, a key logistical point on the Volga River, the gateway to the Caspian Sea, and a psychological target. Hitler made the catastrophic decision to divert the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, directly into the city, prioritizing the symbolic over the strategic reality of the oil fields, a move that split his already extended forces and committed them to a fixed point of attack. Insightful expert quote. Historian Antony Beevor argues that Stalingrad marked the point where Hitler's megalomania intersected fatally with strategic necessity, transforming a military objective into a personal vendetta against Stalin, a fixation that corrupted his entire command structure. Vivid example. The initial German advance across the open steppes was rapid and devastating. Using speed and air superiority, the Luftwaffe's dominance was still intact to inflict massive casualties on the retreating Red Army, leading many to believe the city would fall quickly, a confidence that proved fatally misplaced. The rich explanation for the German initial success lies in their superior maneuver warfare doctrine, the Blitzkrieg, which excelled in the open field but was soon to encounter its antithesis in the labyrinthine slaughterhouse of urban combat, a nightmare the German army was utterly unprepared for, trading vast maneuverability for a bloody block-by-block attrition fight. Obsession dictates defeat. The most dangerous enemy in war is often not the opposing army, but a leader's personal pride and deviation from sound military logic. The initial German attack on Stalingrad in August 1942 was a terrifying, vivid scenario of massed artillery and air power designed to annihilate the city before the ground troops even entered it. The goal was to leave nothing standing for the Soviet defenders to hide in. Compelling evidence. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, executed one of the most sustained and destructive bombing campaigns of the war, reducing over 90% of Stalingrad's wooden housing and commercial buildings to rubble in the opening days. This bombing raid, one of the most concentrated in history, killed tens of thousands of civilians and turned the city into a desolate, cratered moonscape. The German high command believed this destruction would clear the way for an easy ground assault, but the sheer volume of debris proved a fatal impediment to their tanks. Insightful expert. Quote, the German generals, however, failed to account for the unique paradox of urban warfare. The level of destruction created perfect rubble and ruins, the ideal cover and concealment for determined Soviet defenders, turning each ruined building into a ready-made fortress. Vivid example. A contemporary German report noted with frustration that the city has become a gigantic pile of ruins, but the Russians fight from every pile of stones. Finding that the destruction had made their job harder, not easier, by eliminating clear lines of fire and creating choke points at every street corner and basement window. The rich explanation for the counterintuitive nature of the bombing lies in the loss of maneuverability. German tanks and motorized infantry, unstoppable in the open steppes, were rendered useless in the debris. Choked streets, where their long-range guns could not be depressed to target snipers hiding in the basement rubble, forcing the elite panzer divisions to fight as infantry. Rubble protects. In urban conflict, complete destruction often favors the dedicated defender. The ruins of a city become a complex, layered defense system against armor and conventional infantry tactics. The Red Army's initial retreat was marked by a disastrous lack of discipline and preparedness, yet it set the stage for a dramatic shift in resistance, fueled by a personal anecdote of absolute political will. When it became clear that retreat meant disaster, Stalin issued Order No. 227, famously known as "Not One Step Back." Compelling evidence. Order No. 5. 227 mandated that commanders who allowed their troops to flee without written orders would face immediate court-martial. It established blocking detachments, NKVD troops placed behind the front lines with orders to shoot any soldier attempting to retreat, a brutal enforcement of morale. While controversial and morally horrific, the order stabilized the front, transforming the defense of Stalingrad from a military endeavor into a political and existential commitment. Retreat was no longer an option. The choice was to die fighting or die retreating. Insightful expert. Quote, Soviet Marshal Vasily Chuikov, the commander of the 62nd Army tasked with defending the city, famously declared, "There is no land for us beyond the Volga." This phrase encapsulated the fatalistic, do-or-die mindset of the defenders who knew their existence was tied directly to the city's fate, believing they were fighting for the very survival of their homeland. Vivid example. The Soviet forces were supplied via precarious, nightly crossings of the Volga River, a logistical nightmare conducted under constant German artillery and air attack. The 62nd Army was constantly reinforced with fresh, often poorly trained units who knew they were being sent into a meat grinder, but who were equally aware of the consequence of turning back, making their resolve almost fanatical. The rich explanation for the Red Army's sudden tenacity lies in the combination of this political terror and the moral significance of the city. The cost of defeat was understood to be the total destruction of the Soviet state, lending every single house-to-house battle an apocalyptic urgency that the German soldiers struggled to match, trading their offensive confidence for defensive terror. Terror creates courage. Extreme political commitment can stabilize a failing defense. When the penalty for retreat equals the risk of advancing, a defending force achieves a state of tactical immobility and ultimate resolve. The German advance devolved into what the soldiers called the Rat War, Rattenkrieg, a chilling thought, provoking advice point regarding the nature of psychological warfare at the street level. In Stalingrad, the scale of combat shrank from miles-long front lines to room-by-room struggles. Compelling evidence. The Rat War was defined by brutal, intimate fighting. The distance between German and Soviet positions was sometimes only the width of a wall. The defense was structured into overlapping layers, using factory ruins, grain elevators, and apartment blocks as key bastions. The defenders excelled at remaining invisible, utilizing tunnels, sewers, and rubble heaps to launch surprise counterattacks, turning the entire German army's advantage in grand maneuver into a frustrating, claustrophobic crawl through rubble. Insightful expert. Quote, German infantrymen noted that they had successfully captured the kitchen, but were still fighting the enemy in the bedroom, illustrating the absurd proximity of the combat that characterized the relentless, grinding nature of the siege. Vivid example. Snipers, particularly the famous Vasily Zaitsev, became psychological terror weapons, eliminating high-ranking German officers and creating an environment where no German felt safe, even deep within secured positions. Zaitsev's skill made the German advance a deadly guessing game, forcing their troops to fight with constant paranoia. The rich explanation for the psychological toll is that the combat was intensely personal. Machine guns were useless at 10 feet, forcing soldiers into close-quarters knife and shovel fights, stripping away the technological distance of modern warfare and reverting the fighting to a brutal, primal level of attrition that favored the desperate Soviet defender. This urban maelstrom consumed the elite German infantry. Proximity breeds fear. When the front line dissolves into 1,000 isolated duels, the defender's knowledge of the terrain becomes the decisive tactical advantage. The shrinking scale of conflict favors desperation and individual resolve. The desperate Soviet defense inside the city hinged on their mastery of the industrial landscape, leading to an intriguing question. How did key industrial facilities, the Red October steel factory, the Barricade ordnance factory, and the tractor factory, become the final, unyielding bastions of Soviet defense? The answer is that they were defended literally to the last machine tool. Compelling evidence. These massive complexes provided the perfect defensive strongholds, thick concrete walls, underground shelters, and a network of pipes and tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen. Crucially, the fighting often continued while the factories were still producing arms, with workers joining the frontline defense. The Germans had to reduce these fortresses building by building, losing men and time in endless attrition battles against concrete and steel, diverting enormous resources from the crucial push for the Volga riverbanks, draining their manpower reserves. Insightful expert. Quote, Soviet Commander General Chuikov employed a tactic of keeping his defenders hugging the enemy, ensuring the two sides were so close that the German Luftwaffe could not risk bombing or shelling their own troops. This tactical brilliance neutralized German air superiority. Vivid example. The tractor factory, ironically, continued to produce T-34 tanks even as the battle raged around it, with the tanks rolling directly off the assembly line and into the fight, a powerful symbol of Soviet industrial resilience and commitment to the city's defense, serving as a massive psychological booster for the defenders. The rich explanation for the factory's significance is that they were the final anchor points for the Soviet defense, preventing the 62nd Army from being pushed entirely into the Volga and buying the critical time needed for the massive Soviet counteroffensive to be mounted on the flanks, making every hour of defense exponentially valuable. Industry as an arsenal. Key industrial and concrete structures become strategic anchors in urban warfare. The time required to reduce a heavily fortified factory can determine the ultimate outcome of a siege. Despite the brutal losses, the German command insisted that victory was imminent, a fatal self-deception that led to the surprising insight that Hitler had won the battle in his own mind long before it was lost on the ground. The propaganda machine continuously declared Stalingrad captured, leading to operational overconfidence. Compelling evidence. Hitler was so convinced the city was theirs that he refused requests from General Paulus for tactical withdrawals or regrouping, famously declaring that the Sixth Army would never leave the Volga. This belief was rooted in an almost religious adherence to the goal, overlooking the devastating human and material losses the army was suffering. As winter approached, a disregard for reality that would prove fatal to the entire army group. Insightful expert, quote, German field marshals and staff officers noted in their diaries the extreme anxiety over the exposed flanks of the Sixth Army, which were held not by veteran German troops, but by poorly equipped Romanian and Italian forces, a weakness Hitler dismissed outright, believing the main effort in the city negated the need for robust flank defense. Vivid example. The logistical network necessary to supply the Sixth Army's 250,000 men was stretched to the breaking point over hundreds of miles of poor roads. As German forces were bogged down in the city, the logistical tail became incredibly vulnerable, a vulnerability the Soviets keenly identified and prepared to exploit, creating the perfect pincer target. The rich explanation for this strategic blindness is that Hitler allowed political symbolism to entirely supplant military pragmatism. The name Stalingrad became the ultimate trophy, and the cost of the trophy, the sacrifice of an entire army, was deemed acceptable long before the winter snows began to fall and the Soviet trap was sprung. Propaganda blinds the leader. Success in propaganda can ironically undermine strategic decision-making, believing one's own invincible narrative is the quickest path to strategic ruin. The German pursuit of the symbolic city quickly devolved into an unprecedented military catastrophe, leading to a crucial, thought-provoking advice point regarding military objectives. A force built for maneuver will be annihilated in a static, urban environment. The Sixth Army, the spearhead of the Wehrmacht's mobile warfare doctrine, found its Blitzkrieg tactics rendered obsolete the moment its elite panzer divisions entered the debris-choked streets of Stalingrad. Compelling evidence. German tanks, designed to punch through enemy lines in the open field, were forced to fight without proper infantry support in the ruins, leaving them vulnerable to Soviet anti-tank teams who ambushed them from concealed basements and upper floors. This loss of mobility meant the Germans could no longer dictate the pace or the terms of the engagement, effectively handing the tactical initiative over to Marshal Chuikov's defense forces, who maximized the close-quarters fighting. Insightful expert, quote, German staff officers lamented that they had lost their battlefield flexibility. General Paulus, in his reports to Hitler, emphasized that the city required fanatical infantry reserves, not tanks, confirming the profound tactical failure of committing armor to the rat war. Vivid example. The famous Pavlov's house, a single, partially destroyed 4-story apartment block, held out for 2 months against intensive German attack. It became a strategic fortress that neutralized an entire sector of the German advance, absorbing enormous amounts of German manpower and ordnance. The rich explanation for this tactical failure is the German military's institutional adherence to the primacy of the tank. They failed to develop specific urban warfare doctrine, believing the Luftwaffe's massive bombing campaign would clear the way. Instead, the ruins became a labyrinth that consumed their strengths, forcing a brutal return to close-quarters combat. Maneuver dies in rubble. A successful military force must adapt its doctrine to the environment. Rigid adherence to a successful historical strategy is often the first step toward decisive defeat in a new domain of war. Inside the city's factories and ruins, the conflict devolved into the chilling reality of the Rat War, Rattenkrieg, a unique and terrifying form of combat defined by proximity and paranoia. The sheer intensity of the fighting shrank the front line to meters, even feet, transforming soldiers into tunnel rats and scavengers. Compelling evidence. The Rat War was characterized by small combat groups of Soviet storm groups, or assault groups, comprised of 6 to 8 men, who used synchronized surprise attacks through tunnels, sewers, and even holes blasted between walls to take out German positions. This tactic ensured that the fighting was always intimate, forcing the German soldier, who preferred mechanized distance, into close-quarters knife fights and hand-to-hand combat where their technological superiority was meaningless. Insightful expert, quote, Marshal Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, famously adopted the tactic of hugging the enemy, ordering his soldiers to remain within grenade-throwing distance of German positions. This neutralized the German advantage in artillery and air support, as the Luftwaffe could not risk bombing or shelling their own troops. Vivid example. The famous grain elevator became a bloody theater where soldiers fought among tons of rotting grain, often using shovels and bayonets in absolute darkness. The Germans had the high ground, but the Soviets controlled the underground tunnels, turning the battle into a three-dimensional struggle. The rich explanation for the psychological toll is that the combat was intensely personal. Machine guns were useless at 10 feet, forcing soldiers into close-quarters engagements, stripping away the technological distance of modern warfare and reverting the fighting to a brutal, primal level of attrition that favored the desperate Soviet defender. Paranoia and exhaustion became pervasive among the German ranks. Proximity breeds fear. When the front line dissolves into 1,000 isolated duels, the defender's knowledge of the terrain becomes the decisive tactical advantage. The shrinking scale of conflict favors desperation and individual resolve. The psychological warfare practiced by the Soviets during the siege was a fascinating and often overlooked element of the defense, creating a personal anecdote of terror and relentless mental pressure on the German soldier. This was a war fought for exhaustion, fear, and morale. Compelling evidence. Soviet propaganda teams continuously broadcast demoralizing messages across the front line using loudspeakers, including German news reports and weather forecasts from Germany, highlighting the freezing conditions the soldiers faced, interspersed with haunting tics simulating the time until the German soldier's death. These psychological operations exploited the German soldiers' growing fear of the endless combat and the impending brutal Russian winter, eroding the morale that was necessary to sustain the citywide offensive. Insightful expert, quote, surviving German soldiers vividly described the terror of the unseen Soviet snipers, particularly the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, whose confirmed tally of kills, often disputed but highly feared, became a primary factor in the reluctance of German officers to venture into the open, crippling battlefield leadership. Vivid example. The Soviet forces were supplied via precarious nightly crossings of the Volga River, a logistical nightmare conducted under constant German artillery and air attack. The NKVD blocking units often enforced a brutal rotation, sending fresh, often poorly trained units into the frontline meat grinder, knowing their sheer desperation and resolve would wear down the Germans. The rich explanation for the psychological toll is that the Soviets focused on making the German experience as terrifying and claustrophobic as possible. They didn't just fight for ground, they fought to break the German will, turning the rubble into a psychological weapon that wore down the enemy's confidence in ultimate victory. Morale is a finite resource. In a war of attrition, psychological warfare is the key to victory. Relentless pressure and calculated fear can break an army long before its last bullet is fired. The strategic fixation on the city masked a terrifying logistical reality, leading to an intriguing question. As the German Sixth Army was sucked deeper into the urban meat grinder, how did its logistical tail become the fatal weakness that the Soviets successfully targeted? The answer lies in the overstretched supply lines and the exposed flanks. Compelling evidence. Hitler's obsession meant that every available supply resource was channeled into the city battle, starving the flanks of the German Army Group B, which stretched hundreds of miles north and south of Stalingrad. These vulnerable flanks were held by inadequately equipped and often poorly motivated Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies, who were deployed without sufficient anti-tank weaponry or heavy artillery to sustain a major Soviet offensive. Insightful expert, quote, German generals, including General Paulus himself, repeatedly warned Hitler about the dangerously thin state of their flanks, requesting either veteran German divisions be relocated or a tactical withdrawal be executed to shorten the lines. These warnings were ignored in favor of the urban objective. Vivid example. The logistical network necessary to supply the Sixth Army's 250,000 men was stretched to the breaking point over hundreds of miles of poor roads. As German forces were bogged down in the city, the the logistical tail became incredibly vulnerable, a vulnerability the Soviets keenly identified and prepared to exploit, creating the perfect pincer target on the weak, extended flanks. The rich explanation for this collapse is that German high command failed to understand that the urban fight demanded so many resources that it created a vacuum elsewhere. By prioritizing the capture of Stalingrad, Hitler fatally neglected the operational security necessary to hold his surrounding position, turning the city into a deadly, overextended spearhead. Logistics defines limits. A military force is only as strong as its weakest supply link. The operational security of your flanks must never be sacrificed for the political prestige of an isolated objective. The eventual encirclement of the German Sixth Army by the massive Soviet counteroffensive was a final, surprising insight that the relentless urban defense had successfully achieved its primary goal, buying time for the hammer blow. While the world watched the brutal fighting in the city center, the Soviets were secretly massing immense forces on the weak German flanks. Compelling evidence. Codenamed Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive involved over 1 million men, 13,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 900 tanks, a scale of mobilization that completely astonished the German command, who were expecting only local counterattacks. The success of Soviet deception, masking the movement of these massive armies, was critical, as the Germans were entirely focused on the reports coming out of the city center, believing the Soviets lacked the capacity for a large-scale offensive. Insightful expert quote. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the primary planner, insisted on absolute secrecy and perfect timing, requiring the movement of over 1.1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces to the staging areas without alerting German reconnaissance, a monumental feat of logistical camouflage. Vivid example. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet pincers struck the weak Romanian forces north of the city and, 3 days later, the forces south of the city, meeting near the town of Kalach within 4 days. This swift encirclement trapped over 250,000 Axis troops inside the Stalingrad pocket, a catastrophic event that sealed the fate of the entire German effort in the Caucasus. The rich explanation for this swift encirclement is that the Rat War was a deliberate trap. Marshal Chuikov's 62nd Army acted as bait, fixing the best German troops in an endless attritional struggle, while the Soviet reserves were positioned and prepared for the knockout blow, transforming a local defense into the decisive strategic victory of the entire Eastern Front. Bait dictates the trap. Protracted defense is often a tactic to draw the enemy into a fixed position. Patience and perfect timing turn a desperate defense into a game-changing offense. The logistical strains imposed by the siege were not just internal to the city, but were creating the necessary conditions for a collapse across the entire southern front, leading to a critical, surprising insight. The German Sixth Army literally starved itself to death, even before the encirclement. The massive consumption of fuel, food, and ammunition for the siege made the logistical chain impossibly brittle. Compelling evidence. Supply routes were prioritized for the fight inside the city, neglecting the extended flanks. As winter approached, the demand for cold weather gear, antifreeze, and medical supplies, items the German military was ill-prepared to deliver in the vast Russian steppe, skyrocketed. The German high command repeatedly ignored urgent requests from Paulus to stockpile winter supplies, convinced that the city would fall before the cold became an issue, a fatal misunderstanding of the Russian environment. Insightful expert quote. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, later tasked with the rescue attempt, noted that the German logistical system was fundamentally designed for short, sharp campaigns and collapsed completely under the weight of sustained, large-scale siege warfare in the Russian winter, a structural weakness that mirrored the failure of the 1941 Moscow campaign. Vivid example. By November, German troops inside the city were receiving less than 50% of their necessary food rations, while the horses used to pull vital supply carts were dying off en masse, eliminating the last vestige of effective land transport into the city. The rich explanation for this logistical failure is that the German military operated on a faith-based model of supply, the belief that victory would secure the necessary resources, rather than a robust, reality-based model. When victory stalled, the logistical system imploded, making the entire army group ripe for a complete collapse. Logistics dictates limits. A military's operational reach is rigidly defined by its capacity to supply itself. The front line is wherever the last truck breaks down, not where the last bullet is fired. The strategic failure of the German command to acknowledge the danger brewing outside the city led directly to the Soviet hammer blow, codenamed Operation Uranus. This stage of the battle centers on the dramatic, vivid scenario of the Soviet breakthrough and the immediate, catastrophic encirclement of the Sixth Army. Compelling evidence. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched their massive pincer movement, striking the exposed Romanian Third Army to the north and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south of Stalingrad. The force involved was immense. Over 1.1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. The Romanians, poorly equipped with outdated weaponry and lacking heavy anti-tank guns, offered only token resistance before their lines completely disintegrated, confirming the German troops' worst fears and creating panic that spread throughout the Axis flanks. Insightful expert, quote, German field observers reported that the speed of the Soviet advance was astonishing, with Soviet tanks bypassing German strongpoints to maximize the depth of the penetration, achieving the kind of Blitzkrieg maneuver the Germans themselves had perfected. Marshal Georgy Zhukov designed the operation to hit the weakest spots on a front line that was dangerously overstretched. Vivid example. The two Soviet pincers, the Southwest and Stalingrad fronts, met 4 days later near the town of Kalach, an incredible feat of coordinated maneuver across the vast frozen steppe, trapping over 250,000 Axis troops, including the entire elite German Sixth Army, inside the Stalingrad pocket, thus Kessel. The rich explanation for the speed of the success lies in the Soviet strategy. They deliberately avoided the slow fighting for Axis-held towns, focusing instead on rapid penetration, securing the encirclement before the Germans could effectively react or reposition their armor reserves. The open terrain, once the German strength, became the execution field for the Soviet plan. Maneuver creates the trap. Superior force must be applied not to the enemy's strength, but to their most exploitable weakness. The speed of the counterstroke dictates the depth of the encirclement. The reaction from German high command, still reeling from the shock, led to the immediate, thought-provoking advice point. In a crisis of encirclement, the commander must be granted full authority to execute a tactical breakout. This principle was fatally ignored by Hitler. Compelling evidence. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, tasked with forming a new Army Group Dawn to stabilize the front and rescue the Sixth Army, knew that the immediate priority was a breakout. General Paulus requested permission to fight his way out before the Soviet ring hardened, but Hitler refused, issuing a fanatical order for the Sixth Army to stand fast and fight in place, declaring that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped troops by air. This order was based on political obstinacy rather than military reality. Manstein argued that a breakout was the Sixth Army's only chance of survival and maintaining a contiguous German front, but Hitler's focus on the symbolic victory over the Volga was absolute and unyielding. Insightful expert, quote, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously guaranteed Hitler that his transport fleet could sustain the Sixth Army with 500 tons of supplies daily, a guarantee that proved to be a colossal, fatal lie. The Luftwaffe rarely managed to deliver more than 100 tons, often less, due to Soviet air superiority and freezing weather, despite losing hundreds of transport aircraft. Vivid example. The supplies that did arrive were often completely useless. Tropical gear instead of winter clothes, or huge amounts of non-essential tobacco instead of vital anti-tank ammunition or food. The starving troops resorted to butchering their dying horses for meager rations, confirming the total failure of the aerial resupply effort, which collapsed entirely when the final airfields fell. The rich explanation for the disaster is that Hitler had fallen victim to the sunk cost fallacy. Having declared the city taken, he could not psychologically accept its loss, sacrificing an entire elite army rather than admit a strategic defeat and grant the necessary breakout authority. Obstinacy seals the doom. A commander's refusal to accept battlefield reality will inevitably cost him the war. Denial of a necessary tactical retreat transforms a strategic loss into a complete annihilation. Manstein's last-ditch attempt to break the Soviet ring, codenamed Operation Winter Storm, Unternehmen Wintergewitter, provides a dramatic, vivid scenario of the desperation on both sides as Christmas 1942 approached. Compelling evidence. Manstein launched his counteroffensive on December 12, aiming to punch a corridor through the Soviet lines and link up with Paulus's troops trapped inside the Kessel. The main striking force was composed of the elite 4th Panzer Army, featuring powerful divisions like the 6th Panzer Division, including the new Tiger tanks. The initial German advance achieved rapid success, pushing to within 30 miles of the trapped 6th Army, a distance that created a tense, agonizing anticipation for the starving German troops inside the pocket, who could hear the distant fighting. Insightful expert, quote, The success of Winter Storm hinged entirely on General Paulus launching a simultaneous westward breakout attack to link up with Manstein. Manstein sent coded messages to Paulus, urging him to take initiative, a message that became the ultimate ethical test of military obedience. Vivid example: Paulus, bound by Hitler's direct, explicit orders to hold Stalingrad at all costs, refused to move, citing the lack of necessary fuel and ammunition for a breakout and his adherence to the Führer's command, a devastating failure of initiative that doomed the operation and his army. The rich explanation for the failure of Winter Storm is that the Soviets quickly recognized the threat and diverted massive tank and mechanized forces to block the corridor, including the Second Guards Army. Without Paulus's counterattack from inside the S-Kessel, Manstein's forces were unable to sustain their push and were forced to retreat, leaving the Sixth Army isolated forever and confirming the Soviet victory. Command paralysis destroys. A successful pincer defense requires the internal element to move. A strategic rescue fails when the authority for decisive action is withheld from the man on the ground. The subsequent fate of the encircled Sixth Army became a grim, terrifying personal anecdote of slow starvation, frozen death, and final bitter defeat. The German army, trapped in the Kessel, endured one of the most horrific sieges in modern history. Compelling evidence: by January 1943, temperatures had plummeted to 30 squan Suish, 22 squan fresh. Troops, lacking adequate winter clothing, suffered mass casualties from frostbite and exposure. Ammunition ran low, and starvation became rampant. Diaries recovered from the pocket paint, a horrifying picture of collapsing morale, desperation, and the systematic cannibalism of their own horses, with the wounded freezing to death in makeshift hospitals lacking medicine and heat, while Soviet shelling continued relentlessly. Insightful expert. Quote, Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, recognizing the inevitable, delivered an ultimatum for surrender, which Paulus refused under Hitler's direct orders, prolonging the suffering. Vivid example: Hitler, in a final act of psychological manipulation, promoted General Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, implying that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, a morbid suggestion that Paulus should commit suicide rather than give up the city. The rich explanation for the unconditional nature of the defeat is that Hitler treated the Sixth Army as a sacrificial lamb, a human shield whose defense tied up massive Soviet forces for the remainder of the Caucasus campaign. But this strategic gain came at the total cost of 250,000 German soldiers who paid the ultimate price for his obsession. Sacrifice is final. The value of a strategic position can be measured by the cost one is willing to pay to hold it. The tragic end of the Sixth Army marked the decisive, irreversible shift in the power balance of the entire Eastern Front. The final surrender of the remnants of the Sixth Army on February 2, 1943, provided the necessary final insight into the catastrophic long-term legacy of the battle. The Battle of Stalingrad was not merely a defeat. It was the psychological, surprising insight that broke the myth of German invincibility and permanently shifted the strategic momentum of the entire Second World War. Compelling evidence: of the over 250,000 Axis troops encircled, fewer than 90,000 survived to be captured. Of those 90,000, only about 6,000 ever returned home, often decades later, confirming the scale of the annihilation. The loss was devastating not just in manpower but in irreplaceable equipment. The Wehrmacht lost thousands of aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces, a material loss that Germany's industrial base could no longer sustain against the overwhelming output of the Soviet Union. Insightful expert quote, historians universally regard Stalingrad as the single greatest battle and the definitive turning point of World War II. It was the first time the German Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic, absolute defeat of this magnitude. Vivid example: the Soviet Union immediately capitalized on the victory for propaganda purposes, displaying the captured German equipment and the humiliated Field Marshal Paulus to the world, signaling that the tide of the war had decisively turned against the Axis powers, a victory that fueled their final drive to Berlin. The rich explanation for this strategic finality is that the defeat exhausted Germany's reserves of men and material and destroyed their morale, guaranteeing that the long, painful retreat from the east would begin. The sacrifice of the 62nd Army inside the city had bought the time necessary for the Red Army to prepare the single most decisive blow of the entire war. The tide turns at the Volga. A comprehensive defeat breaks the enemy's will to fight and their logistical capacity to wage war. The price of the city on the Volga was the ultimate loss of the Eastern Front.